Chapter 10. There seemed to be no end to the spreadsheets. More than once, Paul nearly managed to nerve himself to go to Mr. Tanner's office and ask what they were for. After all, he was in on the big secret now. There was no reason why he shouldn't be taught. At least it torpedoed what had been his explanation of choice, namely that the spreadsheets were a futile exercise designed either to prompt his resignation or to test his aptitude for some other, more meaningful task. Instead, he was forced to conclude there had to be some very good reason behind it all, something that justified employing two people. He wondered why he hadn't been told what it was, now that he was officially a trainee wizard, or whatever he actually was. Presumably there was a very good reason for that too. Days on end now passed when he didn't speak to Sophie at all, and when one or the other of them did break the silence, it was only to ask for the loan of a pencil or to apologise for the accidental collision of feet under the desk. She went out for lunch every day. Whether she spent every lunchtime feeding ham rolls to the performance potter, or whether mostly she sat on her own in the miserable sandwich bar, Paul didn't know and wasn't going to ask. Whenever it occurred to him that the way he was behaving was childish, counterproductive, idiotic and just plain rude, which was generally no more than 2 or 3 times an hour, a little voice in the back of his head pointed out that she was treating him exactly the same, and somehow that made it all right. He had a nasty suspicion that the little voice in the back of his head sounded just like Mrs. Tanner, but on balance he rejected the idea. He didn't need outside help to be childish and stupid after all. Every lunchtime he'd get out the portable door and set it up against the wall, but ever since the Ankara incident, he couldn't quite bring himself to go through. It wasn't just that he was terrified of meeting Mrs. Tanner again, meeting her and not recognising her, or at least not until it was too late. Somehow he'd lost his taste for the whole experience. It had been fun, no question about that, but he couldn't dislodge from his mind the thought that it was, well, shallow, just as the door itself was only about 0.5 millimetre thick. Flying visits to exotic places where he spent no money and no time, where the food didn't make him fat and the booze didn't make him drunk. How precisely was that different from Mr. Tanner's mum, dressed in her skin-type, skin-deep gorgeousness, picking up cute humans in bars? Goblin is, he couldn't help thinking, as Goblin does, and on balance he'd rather be a failed human being. Instead, he tried to resume the drab but familiar business of being Paul Carpenter. He rang up his friends, none of whom he'd spoken to for weeks. They hadn't called him, of course, and arranged to meet them in pubs. He lost games of nomination whist with Duncan and Jenny, and listened to Neville whining about the inequities of the Microsoft Corporation until it was time to go home. He defrosted frozen pizzas and caught up on his reading. That was all skin deep too, and he knew it, so much so that some days he dreaded looking into his shaving mirror for fear he'd see a snout and tusks. Then Thursday came when he finished his stack of printouts, and Julie came by to collect them, but didn't bring down any more. Instead, she told them both that they were wanted in the main conference room in half an hour. Sophie pointed out that she still had a heap of spreadsheets to do, but Julie just shrugged and said they'd have to wait. So Paul filled in the 30 minutes waiting time by finishing them off for her, something he hadn't even suggested ever since the performance potter had appeared on the scene. The conference room door was shut when they got there. Neither of them seemed to want to be the one to knock. Instead, they stood outside like unwanted carol singers. It was the first time Paul had been in any waiting area outside the conference room since his interview, and he couldn't help thinking that if the magic stuff was worth its weight in dried snot, he'd be able to reach out an invisible hand and press a reset button. But then the door opened, and Mr. Wormtortoise head appeared round it. "There you are," he said. "We were wondering where you'd got to." Today he was wearing a black polo neck under a houndstooth check sport jacket, and the claw on the chain around his neck was a dull ivory colour. He held the door open for them, and they went through. It was the same room, except that it wasn't. The oak panelling on the walls was still the same, light devouring shade of black oak. The table was, if anything, even more brightly polished. The crystal chandelier might have grown an extra diamond or two, but that could just have been Paul's imagination. The floorboard still groaned under his feet, as though demanding to know how long it was going to be before the partners bit the bullet and got rid of this clown. Every detail corresponded with the nightmare vision that had been engraved on his memory for the last few months, except it took him something like 20 seconds before he realised what it was. The whole thing had rotated through 90 degrees. The curtained bay window, instead of being on the right, was now at the end, directly behind the chair at the head of the table. Well, Paul thought, fine. He dismissed the detail from his mind and tried to concentrate. Apart from himself, Sophie and Mr. Wormtorter, who was leaning against an ancient radiator that stood where the window had been last time, the only other person in the room was the grim-faced man he'd last seen at the interview, who he now knew to be Humphrey Wells. He ransacked his trivia banks and turned up his traumatic conversation with Mr. Tanner on the night of the armed goblins. According to Mr. Tanner, Mr. Wells Jr. was an associate of the Society of Thaumaturgical Practitioners. What that actually meant, he had no idea. Mr. Wells had his nose in a sheaf of papers when they came in, and it took 30 seconds or so for him to finish whatever it was he was doing. Then he looked up, seemed to catch sight of Paul and Sophie out the corner of his eye, and frowned. The impression he gave was that they were a tiresome chore that needed to be got out of the way before he could press on with the work he was meant to be doing. Not particularly subtle. Paul was prepared to bet money that the vitally important document he hadn't been able to tear himself away from was the Times crossword or something equally crucial. But it worked, so what the hell?
"Miss Pettingale," he said. "Mr. Carpenter, thanks for coming along."
He paused, as if trying to figure out why in hell he should want to expend lifespan on two such unsatisfactory specimens.
"We haven't seen much of each other since you joined the firm, so I thought it was about time we got together, got to know each other a bit better, find out how you're settling in, all that sort of thing. Everything going well?"
He allowed them a quarter of a second in which to reply, then continued.
"I see you've been working with Dennis Tanner for the last few weeks. Mineral rights development and office procedures."
Silence, presumably requiring a reply. Before Paul could think of anything to say, Sophie muttered, "Yes." It seemed to do the trick. Mr. Wells nodded and jotted something down on his incredibly important piece of paper, probably a South American seabird, 7 letters beginning with J.
"Excellent," said Mr. Wells. "Now the drill is, we like our trainees to spend a few weeks with each of the partners in turn, so we can assess where your particular strengths lie, and you can decide which area of our business you'd like to specialize in. Usually, when we have 2 trainees at one time, we assign them to different departments."
He raised his head as he said this, and looked directly at them for the first time since they'd entered the room.
"But as it happens, right now I'm engaged on a project that calls for what you might describe as support in depth, so both of you will be working with me. Any problems with that?"
This time he allowed them a full half-second.
"Splendid," said Mr. Wells. "In that case, I'd like it if you two would be outside the front door at 6 sharp tomorrow morning, because we've got a bit of a journey. I'll brief you on the way, of course."
He turned his head towards Sophie, scowled, and added,
"Since we'll be meeting with clients, I'd appreciate it if you could both smarten yourselves up a bit. We're pretty easygoing about that sort of thing when we're in the office, but obviously a great deal depends on the impression we give when we're on site, so to speak."
If he saw the look of cold, steely hatred that Sophie shot in his direction after he said that, he gave no sign of it.
"Right," he said. "That's about it from me. I think Ricky Wormtoter wants a quick word with you, so I'll leave you to it."
He swept up his papers, rose out of his chair like a god emperor in a box, and strode out of the room without looking around. Mr. Wormtoter waited until he was out of the room before opening his mouth or even moving. Then he sort of flowed across the room and perched on the corner of the table. "Hi," he said, and smiled in a manner that could have sold a huge amount of toothpaste. "Paul, how's things? Sophie, I don't think we met since your interview. I'm Rick Wormtoter. I look after pest control and stuff like that." He reached out a large, beautiful hand, and Sophie was apparently so taken aback that she shook it and even almost smiled. "I don't want to hold you up," Mr. Wormtoter went on, "and I'm sure you're dying to get back to your Mortensen counterchart, but I thought it was about time." He stopped and looked at Paul. "Sorry," he said. "Was there something?" Paul hadn't made a sound that he had been aware of, but this was too good an opportunity to let pass. Sorry, he said. Morton's encounter? Mr. Wormtoter grinned, in the process proving beyond question that he wasn't related to Mr. Tanner. Those incredibly boring spreadsheet things you've been archiving for us, he said. It's a really rotten job, which is why you got lumbered with it. But the Mortonsons are absolutely fundamental to everything we do. He hesitated and frowned a little. You don't know what I'm talking about, do you? No, Sophie said. Ah, fine. That's standard J.W.W. operating procedure, what we refer to as photographic approach to in-service training. Keep you completely in the dark and wait to see what develops. There is another one of that involving mushrooms, but you've probably heard it before, and besides, it's rather vulgar. He clasped his hands around his right knee and leaned back a little. The Mortensen counter, he went on, it's a bit like a Geiger counter, and a bit like the gadgets the earthquake people, seismologists, that's the word, a bit like what they use for measuring earth tremors on the Richter scale. Surprise, surprise, it was invented by a certain Professor Olaf Mortensen. Actually, he was a partner in J.W.W. about 60 years ago, but he fell down a probability well in 1946, and the chances of him ever coming back are getting slenderer by the minute. Anyhow, Mortensen counters basically record supernatural activity worldwide. We have counters set up right across the world, and about half a dozen in planetary orbit, not forgetting Wells Core 1 parked up there in the middle of the Sea of Tranquility, though between you and me it looks depressingly like it's bust, because we haven't heard a peep out of it since 1931. 1931, Paul thought, and although he couldn't remember offhand when the first Sputnik was launched, he was nevertheless impressed, even though it was just a tad disconcerting to think that this collection of weirdos had actually been leaving their clutter where no man had gone before, while Neil Armstrong was still in rompers. Mr. Wormtoter took a small gold box out of his pocket, flipped it open, took out something that looked like a wine gum, and swallowed it. The loathsome little bits of paper you've been shuffling, he went on, are the transcripts of the readings from each counter. Yes, as you've probably noticed by now, they're just tumbles of apparently meaningless numbers. Actually, the counters record data in digital form, like radio telescopes, and by examining the printouts, we can get all sorts of information that we need in order to be able to do our job. As far as we're concerned, they are the shipping forecast and the FT index and the lottery numbers and the All England law reports and the runners and riders at Sandown Park all rolled into one. And the real pain of it is, most of the counters transmit their data outside office hours. And he stopped short, then grinned. Sorry, Mr. Tanner's sisters and his cousins and his aunts can't resist scooping them up straight off the machines and playing with them. Which means, he added with a sigh, when we come in every morning, instead of a neatly stacked pile of reports waiting for us, there's a dreadful mess all over the mutton room floor, and we've got to pick them up, apart from the ones Mr. Tanner's family have eaten or used as toilet paper, and hand them over to some poor devil to sort out, for which, he added, we're profoundly grateful, though apparently nobody's taken the time to say so. Anyhow, he said, we are. So there. Complete silence. Paul's mind's eye was filled with the ghastly tableau of Mr. Tanner in a spacesuit, planting a flag with the J.W.Wells logo on it, while various goblins floated past him, throwing moon rocks at each other. What Sophie thought of it all he couldn't say, but he doubted whether she was impressed. But that, Mr. Wormtoter said, wasn't what I wanted to talk to you about. Instead, he continued, I wanted to give you the deadly perils spiel. Really, you should have had it on day one, but since our office culture actually manages to achieve the level of secrecy and obfuscation that MI5 struggles so endearingly to attain, it's had to wait until now. Silly, if you ask me, but there you are. Sophie, who'd been watching Mr. Wormtoter with the rapt attention of a snake charmer's snake, seemed to wake up suddenly. What deadly perils? She asked. Ah, Mr. Wormtoter said, I was coming to that. Actually, you've already sort of blundered into item 1, which should have been, for crying out loud, make sure you're out of the office by 5:30. No lasting harm done, thankfully, so we're on to item 2. Now then, have either of you two had occasion to use the lavatory on the 3rd floor? Paul and Sophie shook their heads. Good, Mr. Wormtoter replied. Don't. I'd rather not go into details, since I've got an early start in the morning and I'd like to get some sleep tonight. which I won't if I start thinking about it. Just don't, is all. Item 3, ambient and residual fallout. Actually, this is really bad news. Long story short, we do an awful lot of magic around here. And, well, if you think industrial waste in the chemicals industry is a major problem, you really don't want to know about what we're pumping into the environment 365 days a year. But that's all right, because we're caring, responsible employers, and you're no earthly use to us if we come in one morning and find you hopping around the office going revit. So please wear these. He reached into his other pocket and produced 2 shining gold rings. At all times. Here, try them on. They're one size fits all, and they're fairly harmless. Won't make you disappear or start craving for fish and calling yourself precious. Actually, if you're lucky, these are the Mark 6. I've only got the Mark 5. Reluctantly, Paul pushed the ring on his finger. At first, it was far too small, but it expanded like rubber. He could feel his skin tingling where the metal touched it. Of course, Mr. Wormtoter went on, these little honeys won't protect you against everything that's out there. In fact, to be savagely honest, they're roughly the magical equivalent of the Anderson shelter. Though at the same time, a vast improvement on the alternative, which is nothing at all. Remember, don't take them off, not even for a second, because Humfels and Countess Judy have got better things to do than waste time kissing junior trainees. Item 4. Mr. Wormtoter stood up and reached his hand out over the table. There was something in it, something alive and wriggly. He opened his fingers a little, and a mouse's head appeared between them. With his other hand, very delicately, he slipped a finely woven silver collar and lead over the mouse's neck, and then put the animal down on the table. This, said Mr. Wormtoter, is Kurt. Actually, that's Mr. Lundquist to you, since sincerely he's still a partner in the firm, though for fairly obvious reasons he hasn't been taking much part in day-to-day business for a while. Mr. Lundquist, wave to nice trainees, Kurt. The mouse stood on its hind paws and waved. Mr. Lundquist used to have my job, popping dragons and generally chivying wildlife, until one day he put his foot in a consequence mine. Well, being out of the office a lot and being out of touch for weeks on end pretty much goes with the territory in Kurt's and my line of work, so it was a while before anybody noticed he hadn't been around much lately and came looking. And by then, I'm afraid, the effects were more or less irreversible. And now Kurt's stuck like it, just like his mum warned him he would. The mouse reared up and tried to bite Mr. Wormtoter's hand. Just kidding, Kurt, Mr. Wormtoter said, getting his hand well out of the way. The point is this. Consequence mines, probability wells, Xavier distortions, groundhog Dave loops, you name it, they're out there. This is a pretty cutthroat business we're in, and I'm afraid that at various points along the way, you risk ticking people off, sometimes quite severely, and sometimes, for a whole variety of reasons, they try and do nasty things to you. In Kurt's case, he was tracking down a thoroughly unpleasant character who was in the business of turning dead people into zombies and setting them to work manning late-night internet helplines. This bad guy simply wouldn't come out to play, kept ducking and running whenever Kurt got within a mile of him, until finally Kurt got a bit upset and sent him an email asking whether he was a man or a mouse. Actually, Mr. Wormtoter added, consequence mines are really nasty, because not only do they kill you or disfigure you in horrible ways, they're also designed to make you look like a complete and utter prawn into the bargain. Anyhow, he added, as the mouse made a determined but futile leap after the tip of his little finger, there's not a lot we can do about them, except obviously be careful. And that's a really useless piece of advice if ever there was one, and also to wear one of these at all times. From his inside pocket he produced 2 little enamel badges marked Prefect. Sorry about the lettering, Mr. Wormtoter said. If you like, you can wear it inside your clothes someplace, where nobody can see. I do. The point of these is, as soon as something horrid happens to you, these things send a coded signal to Wells Core 3, which in turn triggers an alarm, and one of us comes and fetches you ASAP. And if there's anything we can do, well, anyway, Kurt here was a silly boy and forgot to put his on. So let that be a lesson to both of you. The mouse suddenly made a determined attempt to escape, nearly yanking the end of his lead out from between Mr. Wormtoter's fingers. One last thing, Mr. Wormtoter added. I'd like you to take a careful look at Kurt here, and then, just for the hell of it, take a gander at his reflection on the tabletop. Paul did as he was told, and upside down under the mouse's paws he saw the image of a tiny man in combat fatigues and top-of-the-range Ray-Bans, a minuscule 1/32 scale Kalashnikov slung across his back, scrabbling vainly at the polished wood with hands and feet. "In the trade," Mr. Wormtoter said, "we call them imp-reflecting mirrors. It's a Chinese invention, extremely useful. Anything that's changed its shape or been transformed by magic shows up in one of these as what it really is. You can stick 'em to anything, within reason. We've got one on our boardroom table because when you're face to face with the other side's crack negotiating team, it does no harm at all to know precisely what you're really up against. The ones you really want to watch out for, of course, are the ones who don't show up at all. If ever you get one of them, I suggest you run away very fast indeed." He hauled the mouse up into the air by its collar and tucked it away in another inside pocket. "Anyhow," he said, "that's quite enough of that to be going on with. The main thing, of course, not to panic or get unduly worried, because although it's pretty dangerous out there, it's not as bad as all that. And indeed, several of our partners have lived long, rich lives and died in their beds, or at least in beds. And if all else fails, I'm sure you'll be relieved to hear that your employee remuneration package includes specialist health care insurance, as well as a generous death-in-service lump sum and an even more generous undeath-in-service annuity, index-linked to keep your dependents in luxury and you in coffins and AB negative for the rest of time. Which is a tremendous comfort, I'm sure you'll agree." Mr. Wormtoter glanced down at his watch. "Well," he said, "I could carry on for hours warning you about this, sounds odd, but it's 25 past, and you'd better be getting your coats. One last thing, so." He looked at them both, and then turned to face the curtained window, almost as if he was embarrassed or something. "Personal relationships," he said. "Now, I know it's absolutely none of our business what or who you get up to or with in your spare time. And if anybody said to me what I'm about to say to you, I'd probably bust his nose for him. But, well, number one, look before you leap. All that glitters isn't necessarily the real deal. And there's absolutely nothing worse than waking up in the morning, flashing your imp-reflecting mirror over the tousled hair on the pillow next to you, and then having to rush to the bathroom and throw up. So, if you don't know where it's been, don't play with it. Number two, in our line of work, the expression safe sex is a bit like saying safe hand grenades. So if in doubt, leave the pin in, or at the very least get rid of it quick. Finally, number three, to paraphrase the King James Version, better a dinner of herbs with a face like a prune, but at least you know what species you're dealing with, than a stalled ox that makes the earth move, but can't necessarily be relied on to put it back on again afterwards." He pulled a sad face and added, "I'm probably not putting this as well as humanly possible, but I'm sure you get the general idea. Anyhow, you're grown-ups. Basically, it's up to you. But use your common sense, and if you possibly can, find an excuse for keeping that prefect's badge on at all times. Then, if something does go wrong, you do stand a better chance of us finding you while there's still enough of you left to find. All right, you'd best be going before the door's locked." Long, chilly silence. And then Sophie said, "Can we go now, please?" And Paul didn't need scrying stones or imp-revealing mirrors or not chocolate-covered dragon droppings to know that she was on her way to meet the performance potter. Furthermore, he suspected that if Mr. Wormtoter knew a tenth as much about people as he presumably did about dragons, he'd have taken one look at the cold glare in her eye and jumped out the window. Paul let her go first, and took care to stay several paces behind her on the way back to their office. Paul had believed in the existence of 6 a.m. for many years, just as he'd always believed in the Yeti and the Loch Ness Monster. In the same way, he'd always devoutly hoped that he'd never have to confront any of them face to face. But somehow or other, he made it to the office door on time to find Sophie already waiting. She was wearing a suit that had probably belonged to her grandmother, who had presumably kept it for funerals. "Hello," she muttered in her best doomed voice. "Hello," he replied, hoping the door would open. It didn't. "Well," Sophie went on, making a mime routine out of consulting her watch. "We're here on time." Paul nodded. "He did say 6 o'clock, didn't he?" "Yes." "Thought so. Of course. Could have meant 6 o'clock in the evening." "No, he said morning." Yes, that's what I thought he said. There were rather more people about in the streets than Paul had expected, and quite a few of them turned to look at Sophie. None of them laughed out loud, which was something. Nevertheless, he could feel the tension building up, and decided that he'd better diffuse it by saying something before there was any bloodshed. "How's things?" he said awkwardly. She looked at him. "How do you mean?" "Oh, generally." "All right," she replied. A long silence, definitely a moment, possibly even a moment and a quarter. And then she scowled and said, "I thought you weren't talking to me." "What?" Paul felt himself panicking. Not a good idea. Today was likely to be a long day, and quite difficult enough as it was without atmosphere and melodrama. No, he said. "I mean, aren't I? I thought I was." "Really? You haven't said a word to me for weeks, apart from pass the stapler and have you finished with the sellotape?" "Oh," Paul said. "I mean, I hadn't realised. No offence. I guess I've been, my mind's been on other things, I suppose." She gave him a look you could have kebabbed sliced lamb on. "So you aren't angry with me or anything?" No, of course not." "Fine," she shrugged slightly. Body language for "you lying bastard." "That's all right, then." "This is stupid." "Sorry?" "Making us get here at the crack of dawn and then keeping us hanging about on the doorstep." "Yes," Paul said. Moments were coming as thick as flies in a cowpat. "So," she said, "how about you?" "Oh, me? I'm fine." "You said you'd been worried about something." He made a show of frowning. "No, nothing in particular." "You said your mind's been other things." Oh, right, yes. He nodded one time too many. Just things in general, really, you know, goblins and magic and stuff." She sighed. "What do you make of it all?" she asked. I don't know," he replied. "I mean, it's all weird and horrible, but we're sort of stuck, aren't we?" "Are we?" "I reckon so. I mean, if we stay away from the office, Mr. Tan will have us doing revolting things in the street." "I suppose so." She looked at her watch again, as if it was all its fault. "Actually," she said, "it's been absolutely terrible, ever since that horrible evening when we got locked in. I've been thinking, if I can't talk to someone about it soon, I'm going to go mad. I even thought about telling my parents." "Did you?" She gave him a "don't be so stupid" look. "Another bad thing is, I suppose I suppose I ought to be able to tell Shaz. I mean, isn't that what relationships are all about?" "Shaz? Oh, yes. Sorry." "My boyfriend," Sophie said icily. "I thought I told you." "Yes, of course. Sorry." "Well," she furrowed her thick eyebrows, "I should be able to tell him, but somehow I can't. I keep trying to, but for some reason I can't. I keep thinking he'll laugh, or he'll think I'm mad or stoned. It's making things really difficult between us." Paul didn't shout yippee at the top of his voice, or dance a hornpipe, or even grin like a dog. He was very proud of himself for that. Instead, he mumbled something about seeing how awkward that must be. "Awkward," Sophie repeated. "You bet it's bloody awkward. Now, all he wants to talk about is these shows and gigs he's got lined up. You'll think it's really important, and the bad thing is, when it comes down to it, all he's really interested in is money." "Oh, it pays well then, performance ceramics." She shook her head. "The money's absolute rubbish," she said. "But every time he thinks he's going to get a show or something, he keeps on about how this time maybe it's going to be something big. Maybe he can get a regular spot at this pub, or if it goes over well at this fair, maybe it'll lead on to other bookings with the same people. He's obsessed with it, really." "Earning a living, you mean?" Paul didn't say. "Sounds like he's taking it pretty seriously," he suggested. "Well, that's stupid," she replied. "Either you're going to be unconventional and a free spirit and not give a damn about the stupid boring stuff, or you might as well get a job in an office." It occurred to Paul that just possibly Shaz the performance potter was suddenly taking an interest in boring, shameful money because he was thinking of settling down somewhat, as people do when they're embarking on a serious long-term relationship. A hallucinatory vision of his mental image of Potboy, who in his mind's eye bore a strong family resemblance to the Tanner clan, snooping round Laura Ashley in search of curtain material for the bus windscreen, knocked him off his axis for a moment or so, and it cost him a certain degree of effort to get back to reality. "I guess so," he said, and hesitated. Here was a heaven-sent opportunity to start tapping in a wedge or two, but somehow he didn't feel like it. In fact, if he had to be brutally honest, he was on Potboy's side. It must be difficult, though, he said cautiously. Getting the balance right. I mean, artistic integrity on the one hand and tomorrow's shredded wheat and toilet rolls on the other. That's just life. She let go another sigh. Well, she said, I didn't really expect you'd understand. For a fraction of a second, just long enough for a photon to travel a yard, Paul found himself wondering whether maybe the recipient of the raw steel in his whole emotional nexus might actually be the performance potter. But he swatted the stray thought with the rolled-up newspaper of self-pity. Not my line of country, really, he muttered. Hey up, think something's happening. Ironmongery rattled on the other side of the door, and Mr. Wells appeared, shutting the door quickly behind him. He was carrying a large suitcase, and there was an even larger duffel bag slung over his shoulder. Right, he said, in a slightly breathless voice. Time we were getting on. At precisely that moment, a large yellow minibus pulled up at the curb. Paul caught an alarming glimpse of red eyes and tusks before Mr. Wells hustled them both across to the back doors. The bus turned out to be comfortable, verging on luxurious. A deep leather gentleman's club armchair for Mr. Wells, 2 airliner seats for Sophie and Paul. On a table in the middle, which somehow managed to stay perfectly still as the bus pulled several G's, tearing away from the curb, was a distinctly fancy continental breakfast. Croissants, Danish pastries, thin slices of German sausage, and Dutch cheese. There was little French buns with chocolate bits in, a jug of orange juice, and a flask of coffee. Help yourselves, Mr. Wells muttered, opening the suitcase and pulling out a sheaf of papers. I've already had mine. After a minute or so, Sophie leaned forward and poured herself half a glass of orange juice. Paul, who was suddenly very hungry, wanted to pile in and start stuffing his face with particular regard to the chalky buns, but somehow didn't like to. In the end, he picked up the nearest croissant and nibbled it, unbuttered. The bus seemed to be doing at least 90, with frequent sudden deceleration for traffic lights and zebra crossings, but the food and the table it rested on didn't shift so much as a millimetre. It'll take us about 5 hours to get there, Mr. Wells said. I should have said bring something to read. A bit later I'll fill you in on what we're going to be doing. But I'd better just catch up with this bump first. Feel free to catch up on your sleep if you like. 5 hours, Paul thought. Oh, shit. Sitting still for hours on end in moving vehicles was one of the things he was least good at, though he wouldn't have been able to read a book even if he'd brought one. For her part, Sophie swilled down her orange juice, opened her bag, first time he'd seen her with one, and produced a fat A-format paperback. Slipware against Franco, he read sideways. Ceramic trends during the Spanish Civil War. The fact that she'd put it away again 5 minutes later without even marking her place was the best thing that had happened to him all day. He didn't feel particularly sleepy, but at some stage he must have closed his eyes, because he slid into a dream. He dreamed that he was sitting in an airliner seat in a yellow minivan, driving at some unthinkable speed through the outskirts of London in the early morning, and sitting next to him was the thin girl whose name for the moment escaped him, and she was fast asleep, dead to the world, so she couldn't hear the conversation that was going on between Professor Van Spee and the tall, gaunt-looking woman with the New England accent, who he was pretty sure was the Countess Judy, the entertainment industry partner and rightful queen of the Fae. I still reckon we should do something, Countess Judy said. It's not right is all. We can't let him get away with it. Not again. The Professor pulled a wry face. It was necessary, he said. One of us had to go. It happened to be John. That's the business for you. Was it really necessary? The Countess pursed her thin lips. I'm not so sure about that. We've really only got his word for it, at that. He wouldn't lie. Not to us. The Countess thought about that. And those poor boys, she said. Even if you're right about John, that was going too far. It's a business, the Professor said, uncomfortably. For pity's sake, Theo. The Countess didn't seem at all pleased with him. Well, I'm not going to argue with you. Not now. But it's definitely not going to happen again. Not with those two. For one thing, they're more valuable. The Professor smiled. Interesting, he said. If they weren't quite so valuable, he paused on the word, would you be quite so vehement in their defence? That's a nasty thing to say, Theo. You know me better than that. Professor Van Spee acknowledged his fault with a slight dip of his head. Also irrelevant, he added. The point you make is entirely valid. They are valuable, but I wouldn't like to see anything happen to them. That said, I am not convinced that anything will. Of course, I don't have your special insight in these matters. Theo, the Countess warned him. All I'm saying is, the Professor went on, there's no real cause for concern at this particular moment. For sure, they're vulnerable, especially the boy, of course. But that's not the point. For one thing, there's no proof, not even any evidence, that the boy has actually got the wretched thing. Even if he has got it, that doesn't necessarily mean he's used it, or even that he knows what it is, or what it does. I would imagine that if he did contrive to figure it out, he'd only use it as a sort of toy, and get tired of it fairly soon. Of course, he added, it wouldn't even be an issue if we hadn't lost the blasted object in the first place. That was obviously a sore point with the Countess. She scowled before replying. Theo, don't be deliberately obtuse. Dennis had them both tidying out the strong room. That's as good as drawing the mountain map with a big red X marked on it. The Professor raised an eyebrow. You think it's in the strong room? Well, for heaven's sake, where else would it be? I don't know. If I knew, it wouldn't be lost. All I know is we've both searched our room from top to bottom 100 times, and we couldn't find it. Of course we couldn't find it as well, you know. Stop talking to me like I'm a little kid. I think the boy's got it, and he knows the boy's got it, and that's what this is all about, and we ought to do something. The Professor looked at her down his nose. What exactly? Warn them, obviously. With respect, the Professor rubbed his forehead, as if their conversation was giving him a headache. Suppose we do warn him. What on earth would we say? Beware? Anything more specific than that would be an unpardonable breach of professional ethics, and if we're wrong, it could be disastrous. For her part, the Countess was losing patience. Have it your own way, then, she said. After all, it's not in my conscience, whatever happens. I can always simply walk away and let the whole lot of you get on with it. In fact, I'm sorely tempted. The Professor smiled. I don't think so, he said. What would you do, for one thing? I can't honestly see you sitting on a toadstool playing on the panpipes all day long. You'd be bored. It was boredom that led you to join the firm in the first place. There are worse things than boredom, the Countess replied, but I can see there's no point arguing with you. Your mind's made up. I still say we should warn them, or at least the boy. No! The Professor raised his voice, which seemed somewhat out of character. We should leave well alone. You too, he added meaningfully, if you're toying with the idea of telling him yourself. Theo, I promised I wouldn't. Ah, but you've been to law school. You know all sorts of clever ways of telling people things without actually moving your lips. I want you to say you won't tell him, sincerely and with all your fingers where I can see them. As he said this, Paul noticed what the Professor couldn't from where he was standing. The Countess had her fingers crossed behind her back. Silly, he thought, but then these people are different. Quite possibly, crossed fingers might be a singularly powerful and significant magic spell, as far as they were concerned. All right, she held up both hands. I promise. I won't tell him anything. Then Paul woke up, and he was sitting in an airliner seat in a yellow minivan, driving at some unthinkable speed through the outskirts of London in the early morning, and next to him was the thin girl whose name for a moment escaped him, and she was fast asleep, dead to the world. The only other person in the bus was Mr. Wells, apparently engrossed in a thick typescript. So Paul sat still and quiet for what seemed like a very long time. And then Mr. Wells' eyes closed, and the bundle of papers slid through his fingers onto his lap, and he snored. Which just leaves me, Paul thought, and for some unaccountable reason he was aware of the portable door, which was sitting in its cardboard tube in his jacket pocket. It was only there because he'd forgotten to take it out the night before. He certainly hadn't intended on using it today, of all days. Nevertheless, a quick trip to Florence or Acapulco would break the monotony of the journey, give him a chance to stretch his legs. Furthermore, the overpowering fatigue that still followed a really long trip through the door would help him get to sleep, which would be a good thing on a 5-hour journey. Having made quite sure that both Sophie and Mr. Wells were fast asleep, he unrolled the door, plastered it against the side of the van, and went through. With hindsight, The mistake he made was not firmly deciding on his destination before crossing the threshold. Instead, he'd just gone through, a stupid mistake entirely due to carelessness. It was, therefore, his fault alone when he looked around and discovered, to his disgust, that he was back at 70 St. Mary Axe, in his own office. It took Paul a moment to figure out what had happened. Then he turned round to walk back through the door. But it wasn't there. The reason for that wasn't hard to guess. He'd forgotten to wedge the door open before stepping through, and the movement of the bus had jarred it shut.